Hello, everyone, and welcome to White Identity Politics. I am Professor Gabriel Selassie, and we are back with part two, minstrels. So, what we're going to do in this lecture is talk about how this idea of white identity politics becomes ubiquitous in American society and will eventually spread throughout the rest of the world. So we all need to take out our sheets of paper where we wrote down what is white culture. And what you should have written down are things that you believe constitute what makes a white person white. So, for example, we stated that we can look at black culture and we can say things like music and some fashion and foods and all these different kinds of things that we would constitute black cultures, because I would think that certainly soul food constitutes what we would call black culture. There is a certain form of music, jazz, blues, rap, rock and roll, were all invented by black people. And the instruments and the foundations of American music were inherently black. So blues, country music, and all that stuff is just inherently black music. So then what did you write down that constituted white culture? So you probably are looking at your list and you're probably thinking, well, not really quite sure. Or if you did write some things down, you might have written down, let's say, eating, I'm just going to throw out some hypothetical things here, like pot roast. The problem with that is everybody eats pot roast. It's not anything that's germane to the United States. So then what else do you have? So the foods, like if you'd say, well, claiming pizzas and tacos and what have you, all of these kinds of things are foods that were brought from somewhere else. Or they're just bastardized versions, like there's no really such thing as a chimichanga outside the United States. It's just a ripoff of Latinx culture. So then what do we have? So probably just maybe a couple of things. If you have something that really is definitive, go ahead and send me a message because I would like to see that. So what does this leave us with? I think that you probably have very few things written down. So then the question therefore becomes, how then do we make white identity politics out of nothing? How do you know that a person is white outside of their skin color? And we know that this is absolutely problematic because there are black people who are literally white. All right? Every black person knows this. We call this passing, passe blanc, where we have had black people who were so light-skinned that they could easily pass over into the white community. And there are a lot of people, Clark Gable, J. Edgar Hoover, probably Dwight Eisenhower, or certainly his wife maybe was probably black. But certainly there's tons of black people that were so light-skinned. Walter White of the NAACP, go ahead and Google him. Walter White of the NAACP. Not only did he have this strange name of White as a last name, that he was so white looking that people just assumed that he was a white man. So he'd get on an elevator and white people would start making jokes about black people, and he'd tell them, I am a black person, and no one could believe him. No one believed him to such a degree that he wrote a book, and he said on the first line of his book, I am a Negro. When you look at Walter White, you're going to be absolutely flummoxed because he looks like a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white man. But he was actually a black person. It's just the way the DNA works. So what this says to us then is that how does one demonstrate that they're a white person if skin color is not the thing that does it? How do you then demonstrate that you are a black person if you can be dark enough to be confused with a black person? Because there are certainly a lot of black people, or people in general, who look black. For example, a lot of Indians, Asian Indians from the country of India, who are really dark skinned, and they claim that they are not black. Now, what I mean by that is that they can probably argue that they have black skin, but they are not Black Americans or African Americans. They say, I'm not African, I'm Indian. And what constitute that is culture. So what I'm getting at here is that how then does the white race get made if we're struggling to figure out what constitutes the white race culturally? So this is where minstrels come in. My argument here is pretty straightforward. What I'm arguing here is that we see within America the rise of American culture in the 1830s, and therefore this correlates nicely with the rise of white identity politics, cultural identity, the politics of the common man. So what happens here is there is a specialized form of American theater called minstrelsy that gets created that's going to help us create white culture. Now, what's going to happen here is, because you can't write anything down, I think, that constitutes white culture, is that what happens in minstrelsy is we create black culture in order to create white culture. What I mean by this is that we can definitively argue what is black culture. We cannot argue what is white culture because we haven't written anything down. So the way that minstrelsy worked is that we defined what black is, and anything that is not black, therefore, is white. Let me rephrase that because you may be having a hard time getting around this little subtlety. We create blackness, and anything that is not black is therefore white. What we have in minstrelsy is what we call racial performance. We look at racial performance because it helps us to understand what we call mythoforms in black expression. White people are literally going to define what blackness is, and therefore we're going to create black people, where before what we had was Africans from various different tribes who were brought to America, who are Igbo, Fulani, Yoruba. All of these different groups then get pushed and mashed together and become black people. So what we have is, by the time we get to Jacksonian America, we are having this surgence of white cultural dominance. White people from Europe are amalgamating or meshing into white people in the United States. They're dropping their Irishness, they're dropping their German, their Italian, their French, what have you, and they are assimilating into this pot of whiteness. But this is kind of hard to define, because while these Europeans now see each other as white Americans, they still have accents. They're still eating the same food that they brought with them from Europe. They are still linked to another continent. One of the things that they bring with them is the aspect of European theater, and specifically this concept of masking. And what we mean by masking is the ball, where you go to a ball, you put on a mask, nobody knows who you are. You can ask the prettiest guy, the prettiest girl to dance. You can make a fool out of yourself and nobody knows who you are. This is a way that human beings got an opportunity, usually a few times a year, to be something that they were not. So what we mean by this is that you could have been a person who was not very wealthy, but you went to a party where there were lots of different people, like this happens in New Orleans and Mardi Gras, where you have all of these different people coalescing and colliding together who, by their very nature, find themselves sitting next to people of a different class. And that's fine for the day because everybody's got a mask on. All are equal who are masked. So you can behave in ways that you probably couldn't get away with if people knew that you were a very important person behind that mask. So for the moment, you escape the confines of your life and you can become something else. This is exactly what minstrelsy was. What you had in minstrelsy were white people who applied burnt cork to their faces, their arms, and parts of their bodies to black themselves up. They simply call this blackface. The early minstrels would literally put on Vaseline over their face or some kind of petroleum oil or some oil. Then they would take a cork and they would burn it down into its ashes. And then they would add a little bit of water and turn it into a paste. And they would apply it to their faces, their arms, their necks, their ears, to then what they call blacking up. So then once you blacked up, you got into your costume and you went on stage as a black person. This is the Illinois Club, one of the many, many, many minstrel clubs and troupes that were in the United States. They were everywhere. Every major city had dozens of minstrel troupes. Small cities had minstrel troupes. The better ones traveled the United States. The very best ones traveled the world. If you notice in this picture, there are a couple of things that stand out. One, there's a white man sitting in the middle. There is a white person who is blacked up standing in the back who's got on totally different costume. I'm going to talk about this character in a minute, but for now, I want to talk about the obvious white man in the middle, and that's the interlocutor. He is the master of ceremonies. He's going to help keep the show moving from song and dance to gag. And so what minstrelsy really was an opportunity for white people to black up, get on stage, and to play their version of what a black person was. Now, where did this all begin? This all began when a musician by the name of Thomas Dartmouth Rice, who went by the moniker Daddy Rice, was walking down the street and he heard a black person named Jim Crow sing a song and dance. And he sat perplexed and watched this black man. And he asked the black man to teach him this song and dance and went back and later put all of this to music. And he created the dance and the routine called Jump Jim Crow. This was in 1828 in the wellspring of the Jacksonian era. So Daddy Rice traveled the United States, performed this act. It was so well loved that he became the highest paid actor in Europe and in America. Minstrelsy was born. A white man pretending to be black, pretending to act black, and to be black. Now, this is something that you must inculcate as I speak to you. And we're going to look at minstrelsies in just a moment, but I really want to impress upon you. This is a white man, and soon there will be white women who will black themselves up to go on stage and perform to audiences and to pretend that they are black people. Now, the show evolved with Thomas Dartmouth Rice and later on with other minstrel performers who saw the show and were completely stunned and blown away with it, that minstrelsy shows became the hottest theater in America and in many parts of the world. People could not get enough of it, and I cannot stress enough that minstrelsy was everywhere. From the upper reaches of Maine all the way down to San Diego, it was everywhere. Every city had some form of minstrel troupe, and if the city did not have one, a minstrel troupe passed through that city giving performances. The show itself became synonymous with two parts. One featured what they called the urban dandy. The second part of the show featured the plantation slave, and that is the character Jim Crow. Now, why the urban dandy and the plantation slave? Well, there were two kinds of black people in America. There was the plantation slave, and then there were free blacks. Many of them and most of them lived in cities. So the show was a caricature of black life. Whether you were a free black person or whether or not you were a plantation slave, white people were going to produce a show that depicted both of these groups. Later, the show is going to move to 3 parts. I'll talk about that in just a moment, but the show itself was singing, dancing, joke telling, and other acts. And here's where this really gets fascinating. There was no television, there was no radio, there was just print. So what did people have to do all day? They sat around and talked to each other. You might have been on a farm. You're waiting for the crops to come in, to rise up out of the ground. So you have time on your hands. You've got chores, but you essentially have time on your hands. So you might be lucky enough to be able to read. So you have maybe 1 or 2 books. You probably get a newspaper every so often, every periodically. So basically, you did things to entertain yourselves, like go to the theater if you had money. You couldn't just turn on a radio or a television set. So what happens here is that these minstrel troupes travel all over the United States telling jokes, singing songs, dancing, copying each other. So it becomes like a meme. It is radio and television on stage telling the same jokes. So for example, a typical minstrel joke is why did the chicken cross the road? To get to the other side. That was the punchline. These jokes were heard everywhere, and soon, as minstrel troupes became so popular, and this became the #1 form of entertainment in America, everybody knew the jokes, everybody knew the songs. When I was in school in the 1960s, when we had, back in those days, they had plenty of money for music and art and all that kind of stuff. When we did music, we used to sing minstrel songs, cleaned up versions of minstrel songs, because many of them have nasty language, the N-word and all that kind of stuff. These were pretty racist shows. I don't want to dispel the fact that they weren't racist. These were uniquely racist. Some were more racist than others. Some of these minstrel actors prided themselves on being able to be as authentic as they thought possible. Some of them were flat out racist and just wanted to make fun of black people. And they did their damnedest to do that. But when I was in school, we sang racist minstrel songs that had been cleaned up because this was the songs that everybody knew. Oh, Susanna. I don't know if you know that song, but that's a minstrel song. Most of American music that you would learn as a young person in school came from Stephen F. Foster, and all of it was racist minstrel mess. So Jim Crow was the slave dressed in rags. This was the plantation slave, and we can look at a little bit of his song, Jim Crow. So everything had to be done according to what white people thought, how black people acted, looked, and behaved. Caricatures, because the average white person in America in the 1830s never saw a black person because they all lived on farms. Everybody lived on farms. Now, if you were in the South, you saw black people. But if you were in Minnesota, Illinois, your chances, and you lived on a farm where, and this isn't the time where they had cars or anything. So you were on a farm, you probably went 3 or 4 miles away from your home at the most all of your life. You're going to be born on a farm, live on a farm, die on the farm unless there's a war. So by and large, you're never going to see a black person if you live in the North. If you live in a big city, you may see a black person, but you won't know a black person. You won't have any black friends. If you were Irish and you were in New York, you might have some black friends or some other portion. But generally speaking, I'm talking in generalities. The average white person didn't know any black people. So it was all caricatured. It was things that they thought black people did. So look at this Jim Crow song. So try in your mind to sing this. I mean, just say it out loud. First on D hill tap, den on the toe. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. Wheel about and turn about, Injo Dejo so. And every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. So it's crude black slang. The second character for this is Zip Coon. This was the urban dandy. This character was actually created by George Washington Dixon, who blacked himself up and he created the character to be a northern urban dandified black. Now, where did the name Zip Coon come from? There was a Roman general who conquered Hannibal and was given the title of Scipio Africanus, because for the Romans, taking Africa was a prize, and they integrated freely with Africans, not a big deal. There were African emperors in Rome. But for American whites, they created this northern urban dandified black to make fun of black people. And why? White people thought it was amusing that you had educated, smart, clever black people. They looked at black people wearing normal clothes and they said that, well, in Africa, all you do is run around in loincloths and eat each other. So the idea of you wearing pants and going to university and becoming a doctor, lawyer was ludicrous. So they wanted to make fun of black people. So they had everything covered here. The plantation slave as Jim Crow and the Zip Coon, the urban dandy, two-part show. Then they came up with a third character, Mr. Tambo. And because, hey, look, all black people love music, right? So this is the three-part show. Now, this not to say that all minstrel shows were exactly the same. They deviated. People got clever. They changed the show. They did whatever they had to do to sell tickets. The more entertaining the show, the better. So what you had is white people blacking themselves up, caricaturing themselves. So, for example, it was in the South illegal for slaves to marry. White people did not recognize slave marriages, not in court. So they made fun of slave marriages. So look at the dress. These are three men. The woman here in the dress is a man, and they're making fun of the way black people's marriages were viewed. The person on the right ought to remind you of something. I don't know if you guys know who Bozo the Clown is, but this is how Bozo the Clown was taken pretty basically from Minstrelsy. The big shoes, the oversized pants, and the banjo, and that's an African instrument that was brought here to the Americas. So this was to make fun of black people. Their handbills, so they would post these on poles, on walls of buildings to advertise their shows. And if you notice, there's a picture of Gorton's Minstrels where the two main actors are shown in their regular, normal face, and then this is what they look like, blacked up, caricatured. Now, the compositions of the cast are going to get quite strange as time progresses on. we will soon see mixed casts of white and African American performers in minstrels. So, what does this mean? It means that black people are getting in on the act of minstrelsy because there's money to be made, because white Americans could not get enough of minstrelsy. So what I am saying here is, as minstrels became so popular, you could put together a minstrel show, hire black actors, and tell people that we have real, authentic black culture because we're using real black people. And you probably would sell out your entire audience. So what does this mean? It means that you have black people blacking themselves up as black, pretending to be white people blacked up as black. So if you're a black person, you can't just play a black person. You have to blacken your face up and pretend that you are a white person who has blacked up their face. Yes, this was absolutely ridiculous. But what we have here is the creation of blackness created by white people and mimicked by black people because this was a way to make money. Now, you can say, well, why did the black people do this? This is absolutely ridiculous. You have to understand that people in this time period, there were few jobs. The only jobs that black people would find employ were manual labor. There were a handful of black lawyers, a smidgen of black doctors, a handful of black professionals, period. The vast majority of black people in 1834 are either enslaved, or if they're free blacks, they're struggling and trying to make a living just like everybody else. So you take the jobs where you can get them. And if you want to be an actor, the only job you're going to be getting is minstrels. White people do not want to see black people not being in a minstrel show. So it's crude black dialect again. Oh, it's old Suki Blueskin, she in love with me. I went the utter noon to take a dab o' tea. What do you think now Suki had for supper? Why chicken foot and possum heel without any butter? Caricatures. So these songs were being played, sung, heard, and they were being incorporated by everyone in America who came to see black people as caricatures, clowns, buffoons, stupid, ignorant, childish, moronic, imbecilic. This was detrimental to black life in America because who could take black people serious after seeing one of these minstrel shows? Minstrels peaked after the Civil War. They were popular well into the 1900s. So if you think about it, so my grandparents were born in the very, very, very early 1900s. And so when they were alive, they were essentially alive during minstrels. They were extremely popular. Probably the most famous of all minstrels became Amos and Andy, who started out as minstrel performers. Amos Jones and Andrew Brown. They were so popular that when radio was created, they had a radio show. Fascinating aspect of Amos and Andy was that when they were on radio, they would start out their shows by being in just regular suits. You see them on the right. When they were on stage, they were on the left. But during radio performances, they would stand and talk on the radio in their suits, and they kept slipping out of character. So they recognized that even on air, even when they were in a studio, they had to black themselves up to always keep in character. Very strange. Now, what's funny about Amos and Andy is that it eventually went to television. But it was at a time when the world began to recognize that this stuff was so bad, so racist, that people, including white people, started to write letters and say, you know what, you got to knock this stuff off. And so they eventually canceled the Amos and Andy show because it was coming at a time when World War II, the Holocaust, racism against Jews, blacks was at its zenith, and people just were not willing to do this anymore. But minstrelsy was still somewhat popular all the way into the 1970s. I saw minstrel performers, people blacking themselves out. Now, and you've probably paid attention to any form of news, and you've looked at politicians and et cetera, even Trudeau in Canada and Northern in Virginia, he's the governor of Virginia, they in the 1960s were blacked themselves up and played blackface, and people took photographs of them, and they were embarrassed just over the last year for doing so. Blackface still remains with us today. You see college students doing this and posting on Instagram and then being kicked out of school for their racism. This stuff still lingers on. It's incredible. I'll tell you another really strange story is that my father loved Amos and Andy, and my father was a black militant. And I said, why do you love that stuff? And my father said, because it's funny as hell. I was born at a different age. My father was born in the early 1920s, where he could not escape this kind of nonsense. But since I wasn't born in the 1920s, nah. Now, my father had enough good sense to realize that Amos and Andy had to be put into mothballs, but nevertheless, there was something that he saw in it that he said it was just stupid comedy. And he didn't take it seriously. To finish up here, we can just say that, to conclude, that the Jacksonian era issued into white identity politics, blacks and Indians and others as seen as enemies of Republican values. Non-Europeans will try to assimilate into white politics and find it difficult. And then minstrelsy inculcates whiteness as a norm. Now, what does minstrelsy look like? We're going to take a look at just a couple of minstrel shows, and we are going to look at here what minstrelsy was like. And we're going to start out with the Christie's Minstrels. Christie's was probably the most prestigious and famous of all the minstrel shows, so we'll just watch just a little bit of it. Hopefully you can hear this.
Participate in idle discourse with the vicarious Mr. Tambo. And another thing...
Just a minute. These good people didn't pay to hear a performance of puny, puerile, pusillanimous
Now you notice how the language, right, that they're using here in minstrelsy, and it's supposed to be a joke because they're trying to make fun of the fact that black people might try to use big words and sound totally ridiculous.
My pearls of minstrelsy and my feather-footed dancing ensemble, I offer you now Stephen Foster's Old Folks at Home. May I?
Okay, so that just gives you a snapshot, the interlocutor, the singers. This is Christie's minstrel. Now we're going to go to look at another minstrel performer, and this is a very famous minstrel performer. It's- So the gift here and the talent is trying to mimic black dance. A white man who is trying to, in some way, show that he has some dexterity with the overall caricature of the dance routine. Look at his steps, look at the way he walks and dances and mimics. This was also famous as well, where he's doing the sand dancing. So again, caricature of black people. So the last we're going to look is at Davison Miller, and this is a very famous minstrel act as well. And part of why it made it famous because this will give us another clear demonstration of sort of the caricature of blackness.
Well, that's all I do is talk about it. I don't ever get nothing. When I left my good job, fancy drink, horses and eggs, pussycat's tails, gin frugal. I ain't drink nothing but water. Drink so much water, my stomach think I'm taking and washing. I'm hungry.
Didn't I tell you I'd stick with you through thick and thin?
Yeah, and the longer you stick, the thinner I get. I be so thin after a while it'll take 9 pussycats to catch a rat in the bosom of my britches. I'm hungry. My stomach hurts.
I know a man who'd give $1 million for that stomach.
Well, he can have it for a dime. I ain't used. But
A tapeworm.
I had one, but he starved to death.
I took out your chicken dinner last
And if you notice in the background, there's a black person who's actually laughing at some of the jokes.
Looking at it.
Went over to the other
Minstrelsy as well.
and Scatman Corrupt.
Hello, everyone, and welcome.
You the laziest man I ever did see. What's wrong with you now? What's wrong with you? I'm tired. Tired nothing. You can do nothing longer than anybody I ever did did see. But I don't feel well. What's wrong with you? Seems like every time I start to blow, I get the feeling. I had a feeling like that once. Yeah, you take a deep breath and then you make a high note and you feel. That's it. Well, what are you doing for it? Well, I saw myself a music teacher and he told me that he thought that I should, Don't do it, you'll bust your jaws. Who was the music teacher? What told you that?
So you can see here that minstrelsy is not just confined to white people. There were black people who got in on the act. Scatman Crothers, the man here, became a famous actor and was in quite a number of movies and TV shows, quite a number of them, and was somewhat world famous and all through minstrelsy. So we're going to close up here, and we're just going to say that minstrelsy became the vehicle by which black culture was created in the minds of white people, and it set off black culture from white culture, giving black culture its identity, and outside of that identity, everything that was not black became white.